Colonial takeover in Southeast Asia. By 1900, nearly all of Southeast Asia was under Western rule. In 1819, Britain founded a new British colony on the small island at the tip of the Malay Peninsula called Singapore. Singapore soon became a major stopping point for steamships going to or from China. The next country to fall to the British was the Kingdom of Burma. Britain wanted to control Burma in order to protect its possessions in India. It also wanted a land route through Burma into South China. The French watched nervously as the British moved into Burma. France had missionaries in Vietnam. To keep the British from moving into Vietnam, the French government decided to force the Vietnamese to accept French protection. The Vietnamese ruler gave up territories in the Mekong River Delta. The French also occupied the city of Saigon. During the next 30 years, the French extended their control over the rest of the country. In 1884, France seized the city of Hanoi and made the Vietnamese Empire a French protectorate, or political unit that depends on another government for its protection. In the 1880s, France also extended its protection over Cambodia, Annam, Tonkin, and Laos. By 1900, France included all of its new possessions in a new Union of French Indochina. After the French conquest of Indochina, Thailand was the only remaining free state in Southeast Asia. Two remarkable rulers, King Mongkut and his son King Chulalongkorn, were able to prevent the French and British from placing Thailand under colonial rule. Both kings promoted Western learning and had friendly relations with major European powers. In 1896, Britain and France agreed to maintain Thailand as an independent buffer state between their possessions in Southeast Asia. One more conquest took place in Southeast Asia at the end of the 19th century. In 1898, during the Spanish-American War, United States naval forces under Commodore George Dewey defeated the Spanish fleet in Manila, in the Philippines. President William McKinley decided to turn the Philippines into an American colony. The Philippine Islands gave the United States a convenient jumping-off point for trade with China. Many Americans, including President McKinley, also believed that Western nations had a moral obligation to, quote-unquote, civilize other parts of the world. The Filipinos did not agree. Emilio Aguinaldo was the leader of a movement for independence in the Philippines. His guerrilla forces fought against U.S. troops to gain their independence, but they were defeated. Colonial regimes in Southeast Asia. Western powers ruled their new colonial empires either by direct or indirect rule. Sometimes a colonial power could establish its goals through cooperation with local rulers or political elites. In these cases, indirect rule was used. Local rulers were allowed to maintain their positions of authority and status. Indirect rule made it easier to gain access to an area's natural resources. It also lowered the cost of government because fewer officials had to be trained. Indirect rule also had less impact on local culture. One example of indirect rule was in the Dutch East Indies. Officials of the Dutch East India Company allowed a local land aristocrat in Dutch East Indias to control local government. These local elites maintained law and order and collected taxes. Indirect rule was not always possible, however. This was especially true when local rulers resisted colonial rule. In these cases, the local rulers were removed from power and replaced with a new set of officials brought from the mother country. This system is called direct rule. In Burma, for example, the monarchy opposed the colonial rule. As a result, Great Britain abolished the monarchy and ruled the country directly through its colonial government in India. In Indochina, France used both direct and indirect rule. It used direct rule in the southern provinces in the Mekong Delta, but in the northern parts of Vietnam were governed as a protectorate. The emperor still ruled but had little power. France had a similar policy in Cambodia and Laos. Local rulers were left in charge, with French advisors to counsel them. To justify their conquest, Western nations had said they wanted to bring the blessings of Western civilization to the colonies. Many colonial powers said they wanted to teach the native peoples about the democratic process. However, many Westerners became afraid of giving native peoples political rights. They were afraid that the native peoples would want full participation in the government or even independence. The colonial powers did not want their colonies to develop their own industries. Colonial policies stretched the export of raw materials. In many cases, this policy led to some form of plantation agriculture, in which peasants worked as wage laborers on plantations owned by foreigners. Plantation owners kept the wages at poverty levels in order to increase the owners' profits. Conditions on plantations were often so unhealthy that thousands died. Taxes were also a burden for peasants. But colonial rule did bring some benefits to Southeast Asia. Colonial governments built railways and highways. In some countries, small growers of rubber, palm oil, coffee, tea, and spices were able to benefit from the development of an export market.